printing shop is generally not considered a classified location. To understand why, we need to define what a classified location is and the conditions that would necessitate such a classification. Classified locations, as defined by the National Electrical Code, or NEC, and other safety standards, are areas where fire or explosion hazards may exist due to the presence of flammable gases, flammable liquid-produced vapors, combustible liquid-produced vapors, combustible dust, or ignitable fibers or flyings. These locations require special electrical equipment and wiring methods to minimize the risk of ignition. There are several classes, divisions, and zones used to categorize these locations based on the type and frequency of the hazard. Class I locations are those where flammable gases or vapors may be present in the air in quantities sufficient to produce explosive or ignitable mixtures. Class II locations are those where combustible dust is or may be present in the air in quantities sufficient to cause a fire or explosion hazard. Class III locations are those where ignitable fibers or materials producing combustible flyings are handled, manufactured, or used. Within each class, divisions or zones further categorize the likelihood of the hazardous material being present. Division 1 or Zone 0 and Zone 1 locations indicate that the hazard is present under normal operating conditions frequently or for long periods. Division 2 or Zone 2 locations indicate that the hazard is present only under abnormal conditions or for short periods. Now let's consider a typical printing shop. The primary materials used in printing include paper, inks, solvents for cleaning, and various maintenance products. While some of these materials may be flammable or combustible, they are not typically present in concentrations that would create an explosive atmosphere under normal operating conditions. For example, paper is combustible but requires a significant ignition source and oxygen concentration to ignite and sustain a fire. Printing inks and solvents may contain volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, which are flammable. However, modern printing facilities are designed to minimize the release of these VOC into the air through the use of ventilation systems, enclosed equipment, and proper storage procedures. Furthermore, the quantities of these materials used and stored in a printing shop are usually below the threshold that would necessitate a classified location designation. It's important to note that the specific operations and materials used in a printing shop can vary. Some printing operations may involve the use of specialized chemicals or processes that could potentially create a hazardous atmosphere. In such cases, a qualified professional should conduct a hazard assessment to determine whether a classified location designation is necessary. This assessment would involve evaluating the types and quantities of flammable materials used, the ventilation rates in the facility, and the potential for releases of flammable vapors or dusts. If the assessment indicates that a hazardous atmosphere may be present, the area should be classified accordingly, and appropriate electrical equipment and wiring methods should be installed. In general, however, most printing shops do not meet the criteria for a classified location. They do not typically handle materials in a way that would create an explosive atmosphere under normal operating conditions. Standard electrical equipment and wiring methods are usually sufficient to ensure safety. However, it is essential to follow all applicable safety regulations and best practices to prevent fires and other hazards. This includes properly storing flammable materials, providing adequate ventilation, maintaining equipment in good working order, and training employees on safe work practices. It is also important to consult with local fire marshals and other authorities having jurisdiction to ensure compliance with all applicable codes and regulations. In conclusion, a typical printing shop is not considered a classified location because it does not normally handle materials in a way that would create an explosive atmosphere. However, it is important to conduct a hazard assessment if the printing shop uses specialized chemicals or processes that could potentially create a hazardous atmosphere. And it is essential to follow all applicable safety regulations and best practices to prevent fires and other hazards. Here's a more detailed look at the key aspects that determine whether a location is classified or not. Firstly, the presence of flammable substances is a primary factor. This includes gases, vapors, and dust that, when mixed with air in certain concentrations, can create an explosive atmosphere. Secondly, the likelihood of these flammable substances being present is crucial. This is assessed based on whether they are present under normal operating conditions, frequently present, or only present during abnormal conditions. Thirdly, the quantity of flammable substances is significant. Even if a flammable substance is present, it may not be in sufficient quantities to create a hazardous atmosphere. Fourthly, ventilation plays a critical role. Adequate ventilation can dilute flammable substances and prevent them from reaching explosive concentrations. Fifthly, proper storage and handling procedures are essential. Flammable substances should be stored in approved containers and handled in a way that minimizes the risk of spills or releases. Sixthly, the National Electrical Code, or NEC, provides detailed guidance on classified locations. Article 500 and subsequent articles address the requirements for electrical equipment and wiring in these locations. Seventhly, other relevant standards such as those from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, and the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA, also provide guidance on hazardous locations. Eighthly, a hazard assessment is a systematic process of identifying and evaluating potential hazards in a workplace. This assessment should be conducted by a qualified professional. Ninthly, documentation is important. The results of the hazard assessment, including any classification decisions, should be documented and kept on file. Tenthly, regular reviews and updates are necessary. The hazard assessment should be reviewed and updated periodically to reflect changes in the workplace or the introduction of new materials or processes. Let's consider some specific examples to illustrate these points. A paint spray booth is typically considered a classified location because it involves the use of flammable paints and solvents, which can create an explosive atmosphere. A grain elevator is another example of a classified location because it handles large quantities of combustible dust, which can also create an explosive atmosphere. A gasoline dispensing station is also a classified location because it dispenses flammable gasoline, which can release vapors into the air. In contrast, an office building is not typically considered a classified location because it does not handle flammable materials in a way that would create an explosive atmosphere. A retail store is also not typically considered a classified location unless it sells significant quantities of flammable products, such as paints or solvents. A restaurant is also not typically considered a classified location unless it uses large quantities of flammable gases, such as propane, for cooking. Now, let's focus specifically on the electrical requirements for classified locations. The NEC requires that electrical equipment installed in classified locations be specifically designed and approved for use in those locations. This equipment is designed to prevent ignition of flammable substances in the surrounding atmosphere. There are several types of protection methods used for electrical equipment in classified locations. Explosion-proof equipment is designed to contain an internal explosion and prevent it from igniting the surrounding atmosphere. Intrinsically safe equipment is designed to operate at low voltage and current levels, which are not sufficient to ignite flammable substances. Purged and pressurized equipment is designed to maintain a positive pressure of clean air or inert gas inside the enclosure, which prevents flammable substances from entering. Non-incendive equipment is designed to prevent the generation of sparks or hot surfaces that could ignite flammable substances. The NEC also specifies the wiring methods that are permitted in classified locations. These wiring methods are designed to prevent the spread of fire and explosion. Some common wiring methods include rigid metal conduit, or RMC, intermediate metal conduit, or IMC, and cable types specifically approved for use in classified locations. It is important to note that the electrical requirements for classified locations are complex and should be followed closely to ensure safety. A qualified electrical contractor with experience in hazardous locations should be consulted for any electrical work in these areas. In addition to the electrical requirements, there are also other safety measures that should be taken in classified locations. These measures include providing adequate ventilation, controlling ignition sources, implementing a fire prevention program, and training employees on safe work practices. Ventilation is essential to dilute flammable substances and prevent them from reaching explosive concentrations. Ignition sources, such as open flames, sparks, and hot surfaces should be controlled to prevent ignition of flammable substances. A fire prevention program should be implemented to identify and eliminate potential fire hazards. Employees should be trained on safe work practices, including the proper handling of flammable materials, the use of personal protective equipment, and the procedures to follow in case of a fire or explosion. In summary, classified locations are areas where fire or explosion hazards may exist due to the presence of flammable gases, vapors, or dusts. These locations require special electrical equipment and wiring methods, as well as other safety measures to minimize the risk of ignition. A printing shop is not typically considered a classified location because it does not normally handle materials in a way that would create an explosive atmosphere. However, it is important to conduct a hazard assessment if the printing shop uses specialized chemicals or processes that could potentially create a hazardous atmosphere. And it is essential to follow all applicable safety regulations and best practices to prevent fires and other hazards. Remember, always prioritize safety when working with potentially flammable materials.